Our featured speaker tonight, Mr. David Spady, is president and founder of Media and Public Affairs Strategy, based in Southern California. He serves as the Director of Government Affairs for Salem Communication and as State Director of Americans for Prosperity in California, a national grassroots organization focused on economic issues, free markets, and limited government. He's a columnist for townhall.com. He's been called the Koch brothers hitman in California, a title that most of us can only aspire to. Mr. Spady's been involved in political and media consulting for over 20 years. His work in the film industry includes such clients as HBO Films, the British Broadcasting Company, and IMAX. He serves as an advisor to such conservative luminaries as Hugh Hewitt, Dennis Prager, Bill Bennett, Michael Medved, and Mike Gallagher. He's the producer of 2 documentary films. The first, Wolves in Government Clothing, exposed how unaccountable federal bureaucrats put the interests of a dangerous predator ahead of humans. The work made a very compelling case that the federal bureaucrat is in fact every bit as much a predator as the wolf, but more ruthless and destructive. The second documentary, titled No Water, No Farmer, No Food, focuses on the subject of tonight's talk, California's man-made water crisis. Mr. Spady is an avid outdoorsman and an international traveler who's visited 21 countries. He earned an undergraduate degree in communication from Azusa Pacific University and a master's in national security studies at California State University, San Bernardino. Please help me welcome Mr. David Spady.
Thank you. I can't say I'm sorry to take you away from the Democrat debate tonight. And we know what it's all about. There's an old radical socialist debating Bernie Sanders. And they're all going to be talking about how to redistribute your wealth. And, you know, at the end of the day, we all know that nobody in that debate tonight is actually going to be in the White House in 2017. So rest assured, you're not missing anything. I'm a country boy, moved to the city. I grew up in Montana. That's where my roots are, and I still go up there a lot. I was there a week and a half ago bow hunting elk with my bow. And when I came to California 20-some years ago for college, the thing that struck me the most was the lack of common sense when I engaged in conversations about things with regards to politics. And it wasn't just that it was California. I was at a pretty conservative school. And yet, even in a school like that, it wasn't Berkeley or someplace where you'd expect it, there was just an utter lack of common sense. And I saw these 2 different worldviews. One that is the conservative view, that even when we don't like the outcome or the way something is, we face reality. And another that looks at the world through this utopian idealism that wants the world to be a certain way. And these are these 2 conflicting ideas about how we process information. And so I engaged in this campaign that's really been the rest of my life of trying to help people shape their worldviews and understand how to process information in ways that helps them come to conclusions that deal with the world of reality. And look, if the utopian idealism of the left actually worked, if it were a reality, I think most of us would go along with it. It's a nice idea that you can live like that, but it's not reality. In fact, usually it's the opposite of reality and what the outcome is from implementing their ideas. So over the years, I've been involved in a variety of different things in politics, from running candidate campaigns to issue advocacy, lobbying, and being involved on the media front. A lot of what I do involves talk radio. He mentioned Hugh Hewitt, Dennis Prager, Michael Medved, folks like that. These are people who, in many cases, are making a difference in helping people shape how they view things. And it's because they have this intimate conversation with people in their cars every day. They speak to millions of people, and then those people speak to people at their family dinner table, at the water cooler, across the fence to their neighbors. And how we're talking about issues, how we're framing things in ways to win people over is incredibly important, because politics is a numbers game. and we need numbers on our side. So we live in this world now that's rapidly changing when it comes to how people learn about the world around them. You look at the newspaper industry, they're struggling to keep their subscribers. You look at a very successful entity like Fox News. Fox News does not deal with hard news a lot. It's really about commentary on the news. It's really more about entertaining people by doing commentary on the news. When you look at where people get information that are in the under 30 class, millennials. Millennials get 60%, 61% of their information about the world, about politics from Facebook. So we have to find ways to go out there and compete with the shows like Colbert or these shows that really are taking ideas and then translating them into something that entertains people. So it's sort of I think a world that is moving away from wanting to be educated as much as they want to be entertained while they're being educated, sort of an edutainment world. And so that's why I do a lot with social media. I do a lot with Facebook, and I do a lot with video production, partly because I have a bit of a background in that. So I've done a number of videos over the years. Some of the more humorous ones, talking about time to sequester Obama's Air Force One vacations, for example. I had 1.5 million views on YouTube. I think I spent $250 on it, but it resonated with people and went really viral. And occasionally I've done these longer form, I call them home movies, but it's they're documentary films that try to help people understand issues. This particular film deals with an issue that the rural part of California has been dealing with for a while. The Central Valley understands water crisis. They've been dealing with it for a long time. People in urban areas have not, because it's only recently that they've been forced to allow their lawns to turn brown, and there's been water rationing and water police, driving around looking to see who's violating the new regulations. They're the ones who need to be educated, and so by taking a film project like this to people that live in urban areas, my hope is that we can educate them and help them understand what's going on, not just with rural California, but really what's happening to them and their food supply. That's why I have the title, No Water, No Farmer, No Food, because the farmer is the key thing in there, and it's our food supply that we're talking about when we talk about restricting water and diverting water to the ocean. So I'm going to show you a brief trailer here of the film, and then I'll get into the broader story about what's happening in California and what we can expect in the future. A lot of this has to do with radical environmentalism, and environmentalism covers a pretty broad spectrum of things, but the underlying goal of this sort of quasi-religion of environmentalism is to limit man's disruption of the natural world. And so to that end, they use whatever means they can, particularly on the government regulatory front, because when it comes to having an impact, government regulation is an incredibly powerful tool for them. And when you are able to infiltrate government agencies from top down with this environmental idealism, this utopian idealism, if you will, that doesn't really deal with reality often, that's when you end up in a situation like we have here in California with a drought that is not a drought, well, it's not the drought, excuse me. The drought is not caused by man, but mankind created the problem. It's politicians in Washington, D.C., it's politicians in Sacramento that are 100% to blame for the crisis that we have in the state, not the drought itself. But we build dams, we build storage mechanisms for the very purpose of not having a crisis in the time of a drought. So when something happens like we've seen over the past few years with a shortage of water, the blame needs to fall where it belongs, and that is with politicians.
You can't farm without water. Ground without water is just dirt, and you can't do anything with dirt. You have to have water to be able to grow crops.
What is it that we want? Water!
Now is the time for everybody to stay together. We have to fight together, because if we don't, agriculture in California will be eliminated.
California's Central Valley is called America's breadbasket. It's a remarkable tribute to American ingenuity. A once dry desert now supports a $20 billion agriculture industry that provides half of all produce sold in the United States. And its irrigation system accounts for 1/6 of irrigated land in the country. But now this breadbasket is in danger, as unrestrained environmental policies and a drought are turning once productive green fields back to parched desert and dust. It's the result of government failing to address the water storage needs of a growing population, and then placing the interests of a tiny fish over those of farmers and households.
The 1973, when the Endangered Species Act came in effect, is probably the biggest reason that I had to cut back on my farming. If the politicians don't figure out how to get this thing straightened out, it's going to be it'll completely devastate me. I'll be out of it. Have no idea what to do. Been farming all my life. It's not like I can go jump in and do something else at 62 years old.
The drought is inevitable. That is Mother Nature's fault. It happens. But a water shortage, that is our fault.
Fish and Wildlife Service came in and said, we need to protect this indicator species. It's non-native, it lives in the delta, but we believe that it is the canary in the coal mine, and if that species is failing, then the whole ecosystem is collapsing. So we need to increase flows for that species and stop all water for agricultural purposes. So all of a sudden, our water system, which was built for municipal and industrial use and agricultural use, was now having to provide for the environment, a third water user.
People in the Central Valley, whether they're small farmers and they're vanishing or big corporate farmers, they have one thing in common, and that is they're dependent on surface water. But the problem is that those water projects were A, never completed because of environmental pressures in the 1970s and 80s, and B, they were designed for a state of 20 million people. Today we have 40 million. And C, nobody in their right mind ever envisioned that the water that was transferred for agricultural uses would be diverted and let out to the San Francisco Bay for environmental utopian ideas, trying to save a bait fish.
We have to ask ourselves, are fish more important than people? This is our land that we're not farming this year.
See, the thing that has always been baffling to me is that there is no shortage of water. There's plenty of water that go by and return to the ocean. And they have these studies that say that it is the farmer now responsible for the killer whale's demise, and the spotted owl and the delta smelt. In a worst nightmare, if it ever came between my children or even your children and the delta smelt, I'm gonna have to go on the side of our children. The smelt will have to just maybe exist in a smaller area. Some environmentalists are too extremist in my point of view. They want to return the natural water spring back to its original format. They want to put salmon in every little stream that was there when the 49ers came. We are not going to let that happen. They want to reduce the amount of dams when in reality we should expand the amount of dams. People are going to continue to come to California. The Southwest is going to continue to grow, and water is going to be the dividing issue.
The Central Valley water crisis has been described as a fight between farmers and fish. But in reality, this is a fight between radical environmentalists and consumers of food. That's all of us. So when government fails to properly manage water resources in the state of California, the result is a man-made disaster with far-reaching consequences, affecting not only California residents, but food consumers in all 50 states and around the world. No water, no farmer, no food is a story of what happens when government fails to do its job and allows utopian environmental ideals to impact our quality of life. And I tried to do a mix of both elected officials like one of our favorite California sons here, Tom McClintock, Victor Davis Hanson, who's a farmer and one of the great intellects, actor Paul Rodriguez, who is a former Democrat, who on this issue alone, the environmental issue, changed his registration to Republican. And he did that because when he went to help from Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer, both of whom he had done fundraisers for, they weren't helping him on this issue. And the reason this issue was important to him is he purchased for his mother the farm that she worked on as a migrant worker after he had made his fortune in Hollywood. And he spent the last 7 years of her life fighting for water because the federal government had shut off water to her farm, and he couldn't get any help from anybody on the party or from the party that he had been supportive of all these years. And he realized that there, again, utopian idealism was putting the interests of fish over the interests of his mother and over the interests of farmers and subsequently over the interests of people that are consumers of food. So it was a fun project, and we're going to be going up and down the state with this and distributing it a number of different ways. But in order to really understand this water issue, and as you can tell, water fights didn't end when we became adults. They're a very real thing, and they've been going on for a long time. But when you have the irresponsibility of government and the mismanagement of people that we elect to look out for our best interests as the cause for a water crisis, we need to be concerned about that, and we need to expose it for what it is so that people can understand where the real problem is. California is a very interesting state when it comes to water use. Obviously, we're this desert area that has a lot of water in Northern California and very little in Southern California. In fact, 70% of all water that nature produces in California comes from above Sacramento, and 70% of the water used in California comes from south of Sacramento. I had a reporter from the Chicago Tribune a few weeks ago ask me a question. She said, why should man be building golf courses in places like Palm Springs that are dry and arid? And why should, cities exist like Los Angeles? It's built on a desert. And why should we, do things to nature that create, these farms in places that are so dry? And I said, because we can, because we have the technology to do so. And there's no reason why we shouldn't do so if it is going to improve the quality of our lives. If you look at the reason why we take water from one place to and deliver it to another, it's because there's one place that's wet and another place that's dry. This has been going on for thousands of years. The Romans built incredible aqueduct systems taking water hundreds of miles. The Egyptians did it. The Greeks did it. In Nineveh, if you go over to present-day Iraq, there's some amazing structures that are still in place that are 400 or 500 BC, where they were taking water over great distances. So this is something that's not new. In fact, when you think about the technologies and everything we have today, it's really quite amazing. Water that's supplied to Los Angeles' 10 million residents travels over 400 miles from Northern California and traverses over 3,000 feet in elevation to get to Los Angeles to serve 10 million people. That's remarkable. When you think about what happened with the Central Valley and how it became this breadbasket that supplies 50% of the produce sold in the country, what you had for the early farmers that came here in the 1900s, a lot of people came here for the treasure of gold, but these farmers realized there was another treasure in the state, and that was this incredible region of the state called the Central Valley, where you have this soil, Class 1 soil, which is the best soil for producing crops, a Mediterranean environment that has 300 days of sunshine every year. And if you can bring water into that environment, you can grow crops like nowhere else in the country and like few places in the world. There's well over 200 crops that are grown in the Central Valley. It produces about $20 billion in agricultural revenue every year. A lot of that is part of our tax base in this state. And the thing a lot of people don't realize, there's 14 different things that are only produced in the United States in the Central Valley, like almonds and pistachios. And so it's not like we can say, well, why don't you take those things somewhere where it's wet, take them up to Oregon or Washington State. They don't grow there. They just grow here. And yeah, we can import them from somewhere else, but why would we even talk about importing? Why would we talk about not having a golf course somewhere that we want it? Why would we talk about not supplying water when we can do it? We have the ingenuity and there is the water. As Tom McClintock points out in this film, nature supplies 45,000 gallons of fresh water to every person on the planet every single day. Scientists and those who study space call this planet, Earth, the blue planet, because 70% of our surface is covered with water. And a lot of that ocean water is part of the evaporation that takes place that brings us our rains and other things. But we live on a very wet planet. We live on a planet that has an adequate supply of water. It's what we're doing with it that becomes the problem. So when you look at why we ended up in the crisis that we're in California, and as I mentioned earlier, I put the blame for the crisis 100% on the shoulders of politicians, but it's really what's influencing them. It's this environmental idealism that says we shouldn't disrupt nature. We shouldn't harness nature in ways that help mankind, because nature and that particular ecosystem has its own needs, and we shouldn't disrupt that for our needs. But when you think about it, all of nature is disruptive. And certainly man, if you think about it, is part of the natural world. And just like beavers build dams and animals build trails through the woods, we do it. But we use concrete. We're a little more sophisticated than the animals. And we do it for the most part in ways that, especially when you think about in today's world, where we're very conscious of our impact on the environment. I don't call myself an environmentalist because of what that term has become, but I spend as much time as I can in the outdoors. As I mentioned, I grew up in Montana, still have a place there, and I love the outdoors. I want clean water, I want clean air, I want a clean place to enjoy outside, and there's no reason why that's not compatible with what mankind has done. I travel a lot. I fly back and forth. In fact, I was in New York for 4 days, came back 2 days ago. I fly to San Diego to speak tomorrow, and I fly to DC for 4 days on Thursday. And every time I fly across the country, it amazes me when I look down how much open space there is, how much, how small that footprint, especially at night when you fly across the country, and you can see where the populations are by the lights. And it's mostly black below you. And so it's not like there's not a place for mankind and a place for wildlife and the natural world to exist and have their ecosystems. But we shouldn't be trying to take areas that we've already developed and take them back to some pre-Columbus ideal, because it simply isn't going to work, and nature is always changing, and so we're just part of that. And so I've been an advocate, of course, for a clean environment in places where it's appropriate. I'm an advocate for wolves in places like Alaska. I'm not an advocate for wolves in Northern California, where they can do a great deal of damage to people's livelihoods. So when you think about this this mindset and how it's influenced government, the most sort of egregious way it's done so when it comes to species protection is the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973. It was voted on by the House and the Senate, passed almost unanimously in both bodies. President Nixon signed it into law. What it was intended for was the protection of species, which is an honorable thing to do, and particularly endangered species in danger of extinction. Since 1973, over 2,000 species have been listed. Most of them are in absolutely no danger of extinction. They may be in danger of not being the numbers they once were in certain areas, but they're not in danger of extinction. And the purpose of the act was to actually restore these species. So when they're listed, there's supposed to be a plan in place to restore them back to their numbers, whatever those numbers are that they think need to be part of that ecosystem. But less than 1% have been restored. So the act itself has been an utter failure from the standpoint of how it's been implemented and been effective. Of the species that have actually been delisted, almost half of them actually went extinct. So they were delisted. Several of them were mistakenly listed, so so it was actually only 28 species of over 2,000 where they've actually had a program that worked and they were able to recover these species. So it's a broken law in that sense, but it's also broken from the standpoint of how it's morphed and mutated into something other than what it was originally intended. And that's often what happens with the courts, where a judge makes a decision about this is what it means, and then that sets case law that becomes a morphing of the law into something many times far different from what it was originally intended. So in the case of the Endangered Species Act, we have a situation in California where the Delta smelt has been listed. And the Delta smelt, as it was mentioned, is not a native species. There's also billions of smelt around the planet. You can buy smelt at the store, frozen smelt, that you can use for bait, and that's often the case when you see guys out throwing nets and they're using frozen smelt for bait. So it's a bait fish. It's not a fish that has a lot of value. It's not something that we're using as part of our diet or whatever. But this particular fish has had a huge impact on everybody's diet, because this fish has in some cases resulted in billions of gallons of water flowing out to the ocean instead of being used for the intended purpose of that water. When we talk about water in California and man's use of it, we're referring to what's called developed water. So developed water is water that's been controlled by mankind for mankind's purposes. So these systems that we've been building for centuries here, or decades here in California, were all for the intended purpose of mankind's use in cities and for the needs of farmers in the Central Valley. Today, half of that developed water flows out to the ocean and is not used. Now, we're talking about today in a time of drought, in a time of need by both the farming communities and by the cities. Half of the water is flowing out to the ocean. Using the Endangered Species Act, a judge last year, so a single individual, made a decision to force the release of 726,000 acre-feet of water. So an acre-foot of water is about 325,000 gallons of water. It's an acre across and a foot deep. So he ordered 726,000 acre-feet of water to be let out to the ocean over a 2-month period. That water, if it had been used from an agricultural standpoint, would have provided food for 700,000 people. That same water would have created 10,000 jobs. That same water would have meant almost $1 billion in economic activity in the state of California. A single judge is able to do that using the Endangered Species Act. So when we look at California's water crisis and the use of the regulatory side of things and laws like the Endangered Species Act, that's a big reason why we have the problem we have. But we also have a lack of foresight with our elected officials, people who are supposed to look out for the interests of the state. As our population grew, we built more freeways, right? We improve our transportation sector to meet the needs of a growing population, but we didn't do it with water. We built these systems back in the 1970s. There's not really been a major water infrastructure project that has been completed in the state in about 30 years. We've built a couple of dams, but we really haven't taken that particular issue on the way you have to when your population doubles. So we built a system for 20 million. We now live in a state of 40 million people. And there's not really anything that's being done to address that. This water bond measure that was voted on 2 years ago. We came out as Americans for Prosperity in opposition to it. It was a $7.9 billion water bond measure with the intended purpose of fixing this water crisis by creating more water storage. The problem with the measure, and we absolutely need that, the problem with the measure was that only about $2.5 billion was dedicated to actual improving water storage. The rest of it all went to abstract conservation projects, including sand dune restoration near the Salton Sea, that had absolutely nothing to do with our water needs. But it was a deal with the devil. The only reason that Democrats went along with that was that the environmental lobby that's incredibly powerful in the state said, look, it's a trade-off. If you're going to do this damage to the environment by increasing water storage, then you have to improve the environment somewhere else. So we're going to take about 2/3 of that money, and we're going to use that money for all this other special pet projects that you're not going to fund, but you will now because you're going to do it through this other mechanism, which is the taxpayers with this bond measure. So we came out in opposition to that. That's not a solution. That's not a long-term solution. And the other thing that you run into with sort of the modern day approach to this is all the lawsuits that will tie up any kind of major infrastructure project for decades. when you go back to the 1970s when environmentalism first started to take hold, there was a project that was supposed to be built in Northern California. It was the Apaw Dam. It was up on the Klamath, and it would have actually had enough water in that dam to supply San Francisco with water for 30 years. It was an amazing, it would have been the largest dam in the country. Environmentalists killed it. If we had had that dam today, we would have a very different situation in the state. We would have had a water supply that was focused on a population of 40 million instead of 20 million. So over the years, we've seen, the Endangered Species Act, a lack of foresight in building the infrastructure we need, and then just mismanagement of water. We have these pipe systems that are old and dilapidated that have water literally running out of them underground. We're really mismanaging our aquifer system, the underground water right now, because farmers that once relied on this surface water are now relying on the water underground, and we see areas of the Central Valley that are actually sinking. And once that area sinks, it doesn't come back up again when there's water in there. So you're actually shrinking the amount of underground storage capacity by relying so much on the underground water. So the crisis that we're in right now is not going to get any better. With this talk of El Nino coming in and sort of solving our water problem, it may solve it for a brief period of time, but not in the long term. We talk about maybe having desalination plants come online, and there is some good to that, but you can build dams for 1/5 the cost of desalination. Interesting little side note on desal. In Santa Barbara, back in the late 80s, there was a drought in California, and they decided to build the first desal plant in California. The plant cost about $32 million to build, and it was going to supply about 7,500 acre-feet of water per month. They built it. It took a couple years to build, and they had this grand opening. And the day they had the grand opening of the dam, it just poured rain. So it actually got rained out. And it rained so much at that time that the dam that they were pumping this water into, Lake Cachuma, was overflowing the dam. So after 2 months, they shut the desal plant down, and it has never been restarted. So I actually did the math on how much they were spending for the water if they had just taken water bottles and poured them into the dam. So the money that was spent on that was about, as I mentioned, $32 million. So it would have been, for each gallon of water, about $4 in those days' terms, and about $6 today. So you could literally take Fiji water bottles and pour those into the dam for what it accomplished. They are reopening the plant. It's going to cost about $40 million to reopen it now. And one of the odd things about it is that under the Endangered Species Act, there's 300 trout that are in this little stream that comes out of Lake Cachuma, and they've allocated that of the water that is going to be pumped up there, that if there's a low water period or a drought period like we're having now, 75% of the water that is being, the salt's being taken out of it's pumped up, has to be let back out to the ocean for the fish. So it's one of these things where you're flipping the common sense and reality upside down, and you're putting the interests of this fish over the interests of human beings. And again, it's one of those species that is a very common species. So just because it isn't in the same numbers it was there a long time ago, and actually, there's a period where it looks like there were none in there, and then they were planted again. So why not do that again? I mean, if the fish leaves for a period of time because there's a drought, let's plant some more in there, and when in times of plentiful water. But a lot of this environmental utopian and doesn't take those things into consideration and think that way. So in California, we've got a real disconnect between people that live in urban areas and people that live in rural areas, and part of that goes back to when you look in the 1900s, 60% of people in this country lived in rural America. Today, that's about 20%. I grew up in Montana, as I said, but my grandparents were Canadian farmers, so I spent a lot of time on the tractor, a lot of time around the farm with my grandparents. I understand and have a connection to that world in a unique way because I was part of that. But most people that live in cities today don't have that connection with rural America. They don't understand where their food comes. They think it somehow grows on the shelves at Costco, and it just the milk cartons appear there, and an animal didn't actually die for that steak I'm eating, did it? I mean, they just have a real disconnect between reality and rural living. And so that's part of the problem that we see in California. The legislators that we've elected that we send to Sacramento primarily represent the urban areas, and there's a real underrepresentation of those who live in the Central Valley and those who are in Northern California, almost like two different states. One thing that the Central Valley farmers understand, and when you think about who farmers are, these are people that have a very unique connection to the land. They depend on that land to be healthy. If that land isn't healthy, if their crops aren't healthy, if the water isn't clean, all those things that environmentalists talk about, that's what farming is all about. Farmers are true environmentalists. They're the real environmentalists. They're working with these ecosystems that they've created, and have this connection because their livelihood depends on it, and our very lives depend on it. And in a way, you can say that our lives depend on farmers being successful at what they do because we consume the food they produce. So this idea that this is a fight between, as I mentioned, farmers and fish is a misnomer. It's really a fight between food consumers and those who are on the radical environmentalism side. And I say that because of how much virtual water is actually part of our everyday diets. So when you think about water use in the state of California, only about 6% of the water that we're talking about here, this developed water, is used in the urban metropolitan areas, a very small percentage. A big percentage of it, over 30%, is used in the Central Valley, and then 50% goes out to the ocean. But that 30%, 30 to 40% that's used in the Central Valley and our rural areas is used to grow food. An average almond takes about a gallon of water to produce. So when you go to 7-Eleven and you grab one of the little almond packets and open up and crunch on those on the way to work, you just, in a virtual sense, consume 30 gallons of water. Now, you may have had a shorter shower because you were trying to ration water. We have our low flush toilets, all these mechanisms with the shower heads that only let so much water out to not use water. But in our diet, we're using an incredible amount of water. An egg takes 53 gallons of water to produce. And these are things you can look up online. You can see the amount of grain it takes to feed the chickens over their lifetime. A cheeseburger can be 1,000 to 1,500 gallons of water when you consider the beef and the lettuce and tomato and the wheat. So our diets are very water heavy. It's in a virtual sense. If you take the average person's diet, a chicken breast is about 130 gallons of water. A glass of wine is 32 gallons of water. A cup of coffee is 37 gallons of water. Coffee is very intensive. A pound of coffee takes 2,500 gallons of water to produce. Well, we all are drinking coffee. We're not going to stop drinking coffee any more than we are stop taking showers. But certainly, we're involved every day in consuming water in a virtual sense, water that was used in the Central Valley by people in the urban areas. The farmer is only eating as much food as a person in the city. He's only watering his lawn. He's using his domestic water use. Where our food comes from and how it gets to our table is something that is the underlying component of this water crisis. When you take a family of four and all the water use and compile it over a year, it could be anywhere from 2 to 4 million gallons of water that household uses in a virtual sense every year. It's somewhere between 100 and 200 swimming pools, 20,000 gallon swimming pools. That's the water use of every one of us in the state of California with the food we consume. So to understand this issue about what's happening with the Central Valley and our water in the state, you have to understand that this is having an impact not just on California but around the rest of the country, with increases in food prices, with a reliance on more imports, with a lot of jobs that are being lost in the agricultural sector, and with people, individuals losing their livelihoods, all because we're placing the interests of a fish that is not a native species, and we're doing so because of environmental utopianism that really does not employ common sense in how it makes decisions. So as far as the future of California, I don't see anything happening in the short term when it comes to really doing what's necessary to build these, the right kind of infrastructure. There's talks about tunnels under the delta. There's talk about covering the aqueducts so that we don't have the evaporation issues. So there are steps like that can be taken, but our population is going to continue to grow. Although I must say that the way things are going in Sacramento with tax increases and every day the news that comes out of there makes more and more people less interested in staying in the state. But at the same time, we can expect that our population will grow. And there's no one in leadership right now in the state that is really talking about doing what's necessary to bring about some change. With the Endangered Species Act, if we had a situation where governors had veto power, for example, to say, you know what, we're going to manage our own wildlife in the state. We manage all of our other wildlife, and in this particular case, we don't think it's in our best interest to list that species and have the federal government managing it for us. That would be one thing that would be a pretty easy reform, I think. The problem is that you have no appetite for that, particularly with people like Dianne Feinstein, Barbara Boxer, and Jerry Brown. The wolf film that I did a couple years ago, one of the things I pointed out in that was that wolves were delisted in Montana and Idaho by an act of Congress. So that not by the Department of Interior, but by an act of Congress. And they just delisted them in 2 states. And they didn't delist them in a standalone bill that everybody voted on. They attached it to a must-pass budget bill, a rider to a must-pass budget bill. That passed, and that's how wolves were delisted. That species was delisted in the state of Montana. It was done so because the senators, 2 Democrats from Montana and 2 Republicans from Idaho, got together and said, look, we need to get our colleagues on board with delisting the wolves because they're damaging our economies and they're not being managed adequately, and so we need to step in and manage them ourselves. That's how wolves were delisted. The same thing can happen with Delta smelt. There's no reason why Congress can't do the exact same thing with the Delta smelt. But Jerry Brown refuses to go down that route and encourage it, and certainly Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer are opposed to that. And they don't want the responsibility. They would rather say it's the fault of somebody 3,000 miles away than take the responsibility themselves for decisions like that. And it's not that you have to delist the smelt forever, but if some species is having that kind of an impact, billions of dollars of impact on our state's economy, ruining people's lives, impacting our food supply and the quality of the food that we have. When we import food from Chile or some other place, it has nowhere near the quality control that we have in this country with the kind of fertilizers that are used and all the other things that impact our health that are part of our diet. So there's a lot of, these things are not considered when we say we have to protect this Delta smelt. The Delta smelt numbers, by the way, keep going down. So it's whatever they're doing hasn't worked. All this water they flushed out hasn't worked. They do these surveys where they go out with nets and they, capture fish. And the last survey they did, they found 1 Delta smelt. So at some point they will, just on their own, and the scientific community has said this, they're going to go extinct. So over at UC Davis, they have a bunch of fish tanks full of them. Well, okay, how about, during the time we're having a drought, we don't worry about it. We'll see what happens to them. But when the drought's over, we'll take those 4,000 and put them in the river, and then we'll have them back into the system. I mean, there's things we can do, and maybe more than 4,000. There's a large number of Delta smelt in aquariums at UC Davis. Let's just leave it at that. And those could be, brought back into an ecosystem at some other point. So, this whole idea that we have in this country of allowing, our government and allowing them to use these regulatory arms to do things like this to our population is something that I'm out fighting. But the problem is that most people are completely in the dark about it. They look at it as a fight between farmers and fish, and why should the farmer be using all that water? Well, he's feeding you. That's why. But they don't, people are not connecting the dots. So we have a big job to do in just educating people on what these problems are, what some of the solutions are, and how people need to, think about things in a way that uses common sense. Think about things in a way that doesn't put the interests of wildlife over the interests of mankind, over the interests of our children. So with that, I will entertain some questions, and we will try to get you out of here if you want to catch the debate at 9 o'clock.
Is the radical environmentalism that you describe evident in other parts of the world besides California, or at least in other parts of the country?
Yeah, it's evident everywhere. Particularly in the Western industrialized country. I think the wolf is a great example of how it's sort of crept into Europe. There are now wolves in France. There's wolves in Switzerland, Sweden, a number of places around Europe, and they're creating some real problems. They're actually introducing them into Scotland. The farmers, again, it's one of these things where people who live in cities who have this idea of wildlife being almost like pets, and our open spaces being zoos where these friendly creatures live. I have a complete disconnect with the guy whose sheep are being killed or cattle are being killed. So it's more of a Western problem. The funny thing is when people are surviving like they are in the third worlds, reality is a little different for them. The utopian idealisms that didn't work today you can't do tomorrow because you'll die. So you have to actually think in a much more, I think, with a lot more common sense in much more of a real world.
All right, next up, can you comment on the EPA's recent attempt to assert jurisdiction over, I guess it's called the navigable waters rule, ponds and puddles and so forth?
Sure. Again, a government overreach. And one thing about those who believe in big government, and particularly this administration, they will use every mechanism they can to control as much of your lives as you can, and find some way to make some tax revenue off of that. When it comes to this navigable waters, you have these gray areas that can be interpreted by judges. What does that mean? What does, what do these terms mean? And the conclusion can be that any puddle anywhere that sits for a certain amount of time becomes something that can be controlled by the EPA. And once the EPA controls that, if you're a farmer, for example, and you have a foot of water that is part of your irrigation system, but it sits there for 2 weeks, that water has to be pure enough to sustain a trout. Or there's things like that you have suddenly agents at your doorstep saying, well, you can't fertilize anymore because that water over there that doesn't have anything in it, but it could sustain that species if one were planted there. Therefore, we have control over that, and you can't do certain things with your private property. So it's, again, a massive overreach by this administration.
Do you have any sense of where the environmental movement is getting its money?
Tom Steyer, they get money from a lot of different sources. When you think about it, what is behind so much of that? And I think it's a feel-good thing. It's sort of like they're tithing to Mother Nature, if you will. That's almost a god for many of them. And so it is amazing how much money these environmental groups have. And what's really amazing, when you enter into these fights and you go meet with some farmer who's got some federal agency breathing down his neck, he's got lawsuits coming from environmental groups, he knows how to grow food, he knows how to manage crops and take care of his land. He knows nothing about politics, he knows nothing about all these laws, and you have all this the power of the federal government and these agencies, along with all these well-funded environmental groups, and so many farmers simply just want to throw up their hands and give up because it's just too much to take on. They just want to raise food and take care of their land and not have to deal with that.
So this question asks, whether you have a relationship with Pacific Legal Foundation, and I want to broaden that to just ask in general, do you have allies that you work with?
A number of allies. Pacific Legal Foundation does tremendous work. There's little groups like that all over the country, but I think there really is a deficit of a national organization like you'd have for gun ownership, for example, with a group like the NRA, where when there's an attack on, you know, a gun right somewhere in the country, you have a national organization that comes alongside them. When you look at what's happening with rural America and with, you know, people involved in agriculture, you know, whether it's a property rights violation by you know, some government agency or some regulatory thing that they're fighting, there is, you know, there lacks a sort of a national entity to take that on. So there are some great organizations like Pacific Legal. We need more.
Do you have any suggestions as far as say a call to action for people like us, just regular citizens that aren't in office? Anyone we can contact, any particular level of the government that we could reach out to, so forth?
Well, I think what we're going to need are people that really put pressure on our elected officials over these issues. They hear from environmentalists all the time. You know, I was doing these hearings around the country on wolf delisting, and it was amazing to me how organized and how in the worlds of social media and everything else, they coalesced around these issues. So they had a public comment opportunity for wolf delisting. Those in opposed to wolf delisting, who really don't have all the facts, you know, really in front of them on what the populations are, there were I think it was about 100 to 1 comments from in the organized environmental community compared to our side of the issue. So they're very well organized. We have to do the same thing. We have to step up and we have to make noise. I mean, our politicians will listen to us. They're listening to them. We're just not making enough noise many times.
Do you see attitudes about the topics you discussed shifting over time, and if so, in what direction?
I think with environmentalism, depending on how far they go and how fast, if suddenly you're, you know, to fill up a tank of gas, it costs you a couple $100. When you see the pace at which California is trying to implement all these things to reduce carbon, they're doing it in a completely unrealistic way. Most of what they're talking about simply cannot happen. And if it does happen, it's going to drive up the costs of everything we do in the state. You look at the transportation sector, transportation of goods, the requirements for transportation vehicles, trucks, are so stringent that they'll be literally impossible to meet. But what it will do, if people are forced to buy new, you know, more fuel efficient trucks, it's going to force them to drive up the costs of bringing your products to your home, and everything that requires transportation is going to have to go up in price in this state. So it's another form of sort of a regulatory taxation that takes place on the public. And when that happens in the state of California, you realize how much cheaper it is to live when you cross the border. There's either going to be an outcry or an exodus.
All right, this questioner is asking, is this shortage really about water in the Delta smelt, or is it more broadly about controlling people by controlling the things we need to live, such as water, energy, land, roads, and housing?
Well, a lot of it's about control. To me, it's about misguided utopian idealism. I don't think that, you know, when you think about people that have adopted these ideas, I don't think that they're all bad people. I think that they're, in many cases, well-intentioned, but they're misinformed. Some of them are bad people. But when you look at the vast majority of people that have adopted these crazy ideas, that have bought into this, they're drinking the Kool-Aid, they're really victims of a leadership that I would consider bad people. But, you know, it's just, I think, misguided, misinformed people. And when you think about where they're getting their information and who's supplying it, you know, the left has a big advantage over conservatives.
So this questioner is wondering, how would it change things if California were somehow divided into 6 states?
Well, when you look at some of the plans, the problem again comes down to population. So if you're dividing it up and you're doing it in a way that's dividing up population, your urban areas that are going to vote for liberals are going to vote for more liberals. So if you divide the state up and add that many more people to the Senate, I don't think we really change it in a way that works to the advantage of our conservative principles. It probably just adds, at best it would be what we have now, but just more of them. So I don't mind the fact that Montana, or in states like that have 2 senators, and California has 2 senators, because I think as we have more and more people moving into urban areas and out of rural areas, that representation in those smaller states is going to be what saves the day for us.
Can you identify anybody that actually profits from all of this?
On the environmental side, well, environmental organizations certainly do. When you think about corporate cronyism and corporate welfare, the whole environmental greening movement that says we're going to subsidize all these products that nobody would buy otherwise because they're too expensive to make work. Yeah, it's profiteering going on there, where people are recognizing that there's something that can be manufactured and sold and subsidized in the process by taxpayers. So taxpayers are often being taken advantage by people that are using the green movement for profit.
Is anyone trying to make the argument that since the Delta smelt is a non-native species, if we're going to go back to the way things were, shouldn't that just be removed, eliminated?
Yes.
And does that argument get anywhere?
Pardon?
Does that argument get anywhere?
Well, it certainly should be removed. And look, if it goes extinct, I guess it'll have to be removed because it won't be in the Delta anymore. But one of the problems we have with how courts look at these situations is how they use evidence that's brought to the court. So whenever a government agency brings their evidence before the court, it takes precedent over private sector evidence that's brought to the court. So in many cases, you have people with an agenda that are part of these agencies. They go out with a methodology that says, here's the end result we're looking for. Let's find that science that backs that up. And then when they take that into court, that wins out over the other science that's brought forward. So that's another thing that needs to be reformed, is how our legal system uses evidence that's brought before them from within government and from without government.
How do you suppose radical environmentalists who consistently destroy jobs make common cause on the left with unions, which would seem to desire jobs?
Well, and you do see some union opposition to some of the more radical proposals by environmentalists. But if you think about what groups like the United Nations that are supposed to be all about taking care of the poor and lifting up impoverished countries, and when you look at what their priorities are when it comes to the green movement, about the fundamental thing that improves our quality of life more than anything else is fossil fuels. Fossil fuels heat homes. They provide cooling. They provide transportation of goods, of medical services. There's nothing that's improved the quality of life of man more than fossil fuels. And that's the target. That's the thing that they're at war with. So when you think about whether or not they're really interested in helping the poor, when somebody like Tom Steyer, if the price of gas were $100 a gallon, it would not affect his life at all. But some poor single mother who's living day to day on her paycheck, if the price of gas goes up 50 cents a gallon, it means a lot to her. And those people are being ignored by the elitism of the green movement.
So this questioner asks, could we form a National People Association, NPA, like an NRA for people's rights? And I guess I'll go beyond this question and just say, do organizations like that already exist? And if so, can you identify any?
A National People's Organization? There's a National People's Republic. I don't think we want to go that route. But yeah, we were a nation founded on the idea that the people are the government here, and we've gotten away from that. As you know, again, it comes back to elitism. It's elitism that thinks that the people almost treats people like they're stupid animals that need some shepherd or somebody to herd them around to keep them out of trouble. And that's where we get into all of our nanny state laws and regulations. And it takes a village, right? And it takes a village from the cradle to the grave to take care of a person, right? This is the mentality that we have from those on the left that really think that we need to be managed from the top down. And this was a country founded on the idea that we manage from the bottom up.
All right, we've got time for a couple more questions, and I want to apologize to folks. We got so many terrific questions here. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, so I'm sorry if I didn't get to yours. The last couple of them here. First, can you share anything with us about your upcoming projects?
I've got a project called Urbanized Nation that I'll be working on next that is about this idea of shrinking mankind's footprint in order, again, a lot of it has to do with carbon reduction, but it's shrinking mankind's impact on the planet by moving more and more people into denser and denser environments. And it's an urbanization that is creeping into every community in the country. You go to small towns in rural areas, and because the person that is part of their planning office went to a planning school where all his textbooks were about smart growth, and when he goes to the American Planning Association meeting like I did last year in Atlanta, and you listen to all the speakers that have this idea that mankind needs to be brought into these smaller and smaller footprints and have stack and pack housing built around mass transit and get people out of their cars and all the other things. There's a lot of negative consequences to that we need to point out, and so I've got another project that will be out next year on that subject.
All right, here's the last question. It's multi-part. If someone here were inclined to help you out financially, where would they go? Who could they donate to? And then related to that, where can we buy your films? Do you have a book that you sell? And if not tonight, then is it online somewhere? Where could we get that?
Well, I do have some DVDs of the film, but I have to apologize. I grabbed the wrong box on the way out the door. So you can buy these, or not buy them. What we do is, it's Americans for Prosperity that is funding this project. If you want to make a donation to it, it's a great organization. And we'd welcome your donation. So for a donation of any amount, whether you want to give $1, $10, $20, whatever it may be, to Americans for Prosperity, you can take one of those home. And you can order the real one off of, again, with a donation of any amount through our website. So if you go to americansforprosperity.com, click on California, you can go there, or go to nowaternofarmernofood.com, and you can find out how to pick one up there. And we'd love to have you guys distribute them to broader communities. As I said, groups like the Archdiocese of Los Angeles have an interest in showing this because they think that Hispanic community needs to see what's really going on.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.